On the 16th of April each year, people around the world recognise the anniversary of the battle at Culloden. This battle ended the rising led by Charles Edward Stuart and had profound implications in Scotland and elsewhere. If you ever have the chance to be at Culloden on the nearest Saturday to the 16th of April, please do so. The gathering that morning, the emotion and the history are well worth sharing. The story of February and March 1746 could be told very briefly. Charles Edward Stuart and the Jacobite army moved steadily northward in the direction of Inverness. The government army, under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, followed them, but never quite made significant contact. At the beginning of February, the Jacobite army was once again gathered round the strategically important city of Stirling, having drawn back there after their victory at Falkirk Muir in January. The Duke of Cumberland was now in Edinburgh, while General Hawley was leading a government army from Edinburgh towards Stirling. He arrived there just a few hours after the last of the Jacobites had left. The chase seemed to be on. At the beginning of February, the Jacobite leadership debated their next action, and yet again it seems that Charles Edward Stuart was outvoted. The Prince was eager to face the government army in battle as soon as possible, but the clan chiefs and other advisers argued against an advance on Edinburgh. The Jacobite army, they said, should consolidate its position and recruit to replace men lost through injury, illness and desertion. They should retreat to the Highlands, secure their position there, and restart the campaign in the springtime. Charles accepted this decision, but he's quoted as saying, "But I take God to witness that I do this with the greatest reluctance, and that I wash my hands of the fatal consequences which I see but cannot help." So was he right? On the 3rd of February, the army started its move north and broke into 3 divisions. One went via Perth and Aberdeen, one via Speyside, and the third, including Charles himself, direct to Inverness, almost following the present-day Nairn road. The Prince and his men spent a few days at Blair Castle and took time for a shooting party, but they received news of government forces in Dunkeld, just a few miles away. They rejected the idea of trying to hold the pass of Killiecrankie and left Blair on the 10th of February, marching northwards. Their plan was to reach Inverness and join up with Murray and his men, who had travelled via Aberdeen. They would take that town after driving Lord Loudon away, thus securing the Highlands and deterring any government attack, especially during the winter months. While the Jacobite army was marching north, the Duke of Cumberland and General Hawley continued their advance from Edinburgh and quickly took control of Stirling, including its important castle, which had been held by government forces throughout. Stirling and its castle had strategic importance. The bridge, which was just below the castle and protected by its guns, was the first which allowed a crossing of the River Forth. Between there and the North Sea at Edinburgh, there were no bridges, just a few ferry crossings. So Stirling was the key bottleneck for any army travelling between the Highlands and the Lowlands. Returning to Perth, Cumberland decided that he would follow the Jacobites up the coast road to Aberdeen. They left Perth on the 20th of February, and the first men reached Aberdeen on the 25th, with Cumberland himself arriving 2 days later. The Jacobites under Murray had left just a few days earlier, and were heading for Inverness by this time. One major advantage of the East Coast route and a base in Aberdeen was that the government could rely on support from the Royal Navy. Once in Aberdeen, Cumberland set about organising his troops and setting up training regimes to prepare them for the final battle with the Jacobites, which he believed was not far away. From the story of February so far, you may think that the Jacobite and government forces scarcely came face to face in the month, but on at least 2 occasions this was not so, and on each occasion success went to the Jacobites. Rutland Barracks was surrendered by the government forces despite earlier resistance, and round about 3,000 Jacobites rested there from the 12th of February for 3 days before moving on towards Inverness. Prince Charles himself broke the journey at Moy Hall on the 16th and stayed there with a small force. News of Charles's visit to Moy reached Lord Loudon, who was commanding the government forces in Inverness, and leaving a garrison behind him, he set off on the 8-mile journey with some 1,200 men to capture the prince. But the Jacobites got to know of this plan, and 5 men, including the local blacksmith, were sent out to delay the attacking force. An advance group of Loudon's men met up with the 5 from Moy. Inaccurate shots were fired in the darkness. Hearing the noise and expecting that greater resistance was facing them, one of Loudon's companies turned to run, and the rest went with them. Loudon held on to some men, formed a line, and some firing started. No one knows who was firing at whom, but when a piper close to Loudon was hit, the element of surprise was lost, and they retreated to Inverness. So the rout of Moy was over. A little postscript to this: the government piper who was killed was called Donald Ban Macniven, renowned as being amongst the best in Scotland. The legend is that he foresaw his own death and composed a lament called Macniven Will Never Return, which is still played today, perhaps by some who don't know which army he had been with. At the time, Fort George was in the centre of Inverness, and Lord Loudon had some 1,700 men there, despite the desertion of around 200 following the flight from Moy. But he was now faced with Prince Charles advancing from the south and Lord George Murray from the east. On the 18th of February, the Jacobite army crossed Dromossie Moor outside Inverness, and Lord Loudon took his forces out of the city, leaving only Fort George with troops, then went across the firth onto the Black Isle. The Jacobites entered Inverness the next day unopposed. Laying siege to Fort George, the Jacobites started tunnelling operations to undermine its walls. The cannon in the castle could not depress far enough to fire on the tunnellers, and after failing to stop them by throwing hand grenades, the commander of the fort, a Major Grant, surrendered to the Jacobites. He was later tried from this and dismissed from the army. The Jacobites then proceeded to destroy the fort, and perhaps the only casualty occurred during this destruction, when a French sergeant managed to kill himself in an explosion during demolition. It's said that his dog survived the experience, despite being blown all the way across the River Ness. The Jacobites now had control of Inverness. As soon as his forces were in Aberdeen early in March, Cumberland started some serious training. He and many of his officers had previous experience of fighting against Highland regiments. The defeats of government forces at Prestonpans in September the previous year and at Falkirk earlier in 1746 were largely due to the impact of the Highland charge. In both battles, the government army had failed to stand firm when faced by an onrushing mass of Scots armed with muskets, broadswords and dirks, and shouting their clan war cries. Cumberland knew that his men had to be prepared to face this challenge in the coming battle. The threat of the Highland charge can be experienced in the immersion theatre at the Culloden Battlefield Visitors Centre. The training consisted of measures to increase discipline and to avoid the temptation to flee from a charge, but also practice in two specifics, which was likely to increase confidence in the troops. The first was a concentration on the ability of the soldiers to stand in line, usually in three ranks, and to fire in volleys at the rate of 3 shots each minute. That's not an easy task with a single-shot front-loaded musket. The second initiative was a change in the use of bayonets when the charging forces reached the enemy's front line. Cumberland hoped that these changes would improve the skill and critically the confidence of his men in the battle to come. This would be tested in April at Culloden. The Jacobites had destroyed Fort George in Inverness and were now intent on taking control of the 2 other government outposts in the Great Glen, Fort Augustus and Fort William. Both had been under occasional attack, and early in March, the Jacobites laid siege to Fort Augustus. On the 5th of March, during an attack, the magazine exploded, and the commander, a Major Wentworth, surrendered to the attackers. He suffered the same fate as his colleague at Fort George earlier. He was tried, cashiered, and dismissed from the army. Loudon's forces, north of Dornoch, was added to by some 2,000 recruits on the government side who had been recruited in the far north. As this restricted Jacobite movement and recruitment, the Earl of Cromarty and Lord Kilmarnock were sent north by Prince Charles to deal with them. The Jacobite force had no boats when they reached the Dornoch Firth and had to make the near 60-mile diversion round the head of the loch. The boats which they needed were in the hands of the government forces on the north bank. So hearing of the Jacobite march to the west, Loudon sent men in these boats across to the south side of the firth, threatening an attack on Tain and the surrounding area. The Jacobites heard of this and had no choice but to turn back to protect Tain. More decisive leadership was needed, and Prince Charles gave the command to the Duke of Perth. Moving men down to Findhorn and gathering as many fishing boats as possible, he managed to avoid the Royal Navy, and on March the 20th, he landed a force near Dornoch, taking the government forces by surprise. Their forces were stretched all along the Dornoch Firth and the River Shin, with Loudon himself inland at Shin. Major Mackenzie, in charge of government forces at Dornoch, also decided to surrender to the Jacobites. But before doing so, he allowed some of his men to leave the area. They were mainly men who had been taken prisoner at Preston Pans and had pledged not to fight against the Jacobites in future. Having broken that oath, as many did, Mackenzie was concerned about their treatment if they were again taken prisoner and recognised as Preston Pans men. The escaping government soldiers fled west across the mainland, many of them not stopping until they reached Skye. The Jacobites now had a sizable force north of Dornoch at the end of March, a force which would have been very useful only 2 weeks later if only they'd been at Culloden. Farther south, round about Blair, also Dunkeld and Perth, there were few government forces, as most had travelled north with the Duke of Cumberland. But there were some 5,000 troops from Hesse in Germany, under the command of Prince Frederick of Hesse-Kassel. They had been left in the southern highlands partly as a reserve force, and partly because the Duke of Cumberland was unsure about their willingness to fight against the Jacobites. In the end, they refused to fight because Cumberland would not agree to allow prisoner exchange. On the 17th of March, Lord George Murray and some 700 men left Dalnaspiddle a few miles north of Blerathel and moved south. After some action round about Loch Rannoch, they headed for Blair Castle and set up a siege after demanding surrender. Again, as in the west of Scotland, much of the action was between Scottish soldiers, the Jacobite forces of Macpherson's and Atholl against government soldiers represented mainly by Campbells. Several small battles took place round about Dunkeld, Killiecrankie and Blair Castle, as both sides fought for a secure hold and ultimately the possibility of taking Perth. But aware of the build-up of Cumberland's forces round about Aberdeen and facing the prospect of a major battle, Charles Edward Stuart issued orders for Lord George to return to Inverness. On the 30th of March, the siege of Blair Castle was lifted. The Macphersons were left to guard the central route to Inverness, and Murray came north again with his Atholl men. In the west of Scotland, the government post at Fort William had been held throughout by government troops, despite intermittent attack by Jacobites. In large part, this was due to the support which was offered by the Royal Navy. It now resisted further attacks in March 1746, and the Navy was not only involved in providing food and firepower to the fort, they were also used to deter any French ships approaching and restricting any possible movement of clansmen from the Western Isles and seeking to attack the rebels and their property. Throughout March and February 1746, several ships had been involved in these activities, and early in March, two of these ships, the Princess Anne and the aptly named Terror, set off on what can only be termed as a punishment mission. They had been joined by militiamen, so together with their armed sailors, they made a significant force. They attacked the shores of the Sound of Mull and several of the islands, burning homes, killing cattle, and sadly some unfortunate locals. They left part of the area in ruins. This greatly concerned the Duke of Argyll, leader of the Campbells and a major government supporter. Partly this was because many of the people attacked were his tenants, but he also feared reprisal attacks from Jacobite forces. Even though the Navy were operating under the orders of the Duke of Cumberland, Argyll wrote to all ships' captains late in March, urging them not to punish the innocent along with the guilty, and to exercise some control over their men. News of these attacks had reached Prince Charles in Inverness, and encouraged by leaders of Western clans, he declared that any Campbell prisoners should remain locked in the Tolbooth prison in Inverness, a different treatment from his usual way of dealing with prisoners. Some of the clan chiefs even urged him to say that for every house that was burned, a Campbell should be hanged. The conflict in the West seems now to have become one which largely involved Scot against Scot. This emphasises once again that the 1745 Rising was never a simple one of England against Scotland. One more incident during the month of March 1746 still echoes down the years. This concerns a Royal Navy ship called the Hazard. This had been captured by the Jacobite and French forces in November 1745 and renamed the Prince Charles. With others, the ship had been used to avoid the Royal Navy and deliver supplies, and in some cases soldiers, along the east coast of Scotland. In mid-March, with a cargo of supplies, some soldiers, some French and Spanish officers, and some £12,000 in gold, equivalent to around about £2 million today, the Prince Charles set off up the coast. Her master was planning to use Port Soy in Banffshire, as Aberdeen was under government control, but he was intercepted by navy ships and chased north up the coast. Reaching the Kyle of Sutherland on the north coast after a 3-hour naval battle, they seemed to have no alternative but to surrender. But the French soldiers on board were not ready to give up, and taking the gold, they went ashore and set off to march to Inverness. Did they realise that this would involve a march of almost 100 miles through a near trackless land populated by many government supporters? They were soon faced by men of the government army. Realising that their plan had failed, they surrendered, but only, it is said, after dumping the gold in a nearby loch. Was the gold taken by the government soldiers, or was it rescued later by local Jacobites? Or was it really thrown into the water? Is it still there? Probably not. It was most likely recovered and spent in the 10 years following the Rising. So the months of February and March 1746 were not a standstill period. There was certainly a gathering of forces round about Aberdeen and Inverness, but plenty of action throughout many parts of Scotland. In the far north, the west coast and islands, and in the southern Highlands, Jacobite and government forces tried to consolidate their positions. By the end of March, most government forces were gathering for a major battle. Cumberland was in Aberdeen, with most of his men training for the fight to come. The government has secured control of almost all central Scotland and the far north. Charles Edward Stuart was in Inverness with most of his forces. These from the expedition to Blair Athol were still travelling north, and men under the command of Kilmarnock and Cromarty were slowly making their way back after chasing Lord Loudon away from the Rands round about the Dornoch Firth. But before we leave this period, just imagine what if the surprise attack from Inverness had worked and Charles Edward Stuart had been captured at Moyhall or even killed. Would the Jacobite Rising have collapsed? Or, if it was carried on, who would have been the new leader? If the Rising had been over, how would the government have reacted? Would the slaughter of Culloden have been avoided and the punishment of the Scots never have happened? Would all those who left Scotland by their own decision or by transportation have stayed at home? And what effect would that have had on Scotland, and even on North America? Yet another what if, which could have impacted on the outcome of the Rising. As it was, action was now focusing on the lands along the southern edge of the Moray Firth. A major confrontation could not be far away, but when and where would it be?